This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 209 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Today, I'm sharing a Q&A session I did in the Language Therapy Advanced Foundations members group relating to how to support students through semantic study and working on complex syntax. I always get questions about how to scaffold and really just how to implement some of the frameworks that I'm sharing. So I always want to show some of these examples and share them because these are questions that come up over and over again. So in this session, I addressed the following frequently asked questions. How do I help students who struggle to define and describe words without making them prompt dependent? How do I make semantic study more contextualized? And what's the difference between a task-based goal and a strategy-based goal? And which type of goals should I be using for language and executive functioning? I always get questions about goals. I think that's something that we stress out about a lot as clinicians. And so I always like to share my philosophy as well as some strategies and examples of goals that you can use when figuring out how to take things that are difficult to measure, such as internal cognitive processes, and turning them into observable behaviors. And also finding that balance between focusing on things that we can observe, but also not completely forgetting about the internal processes that go along. So I think just understanding what is our end goal when we're trying to work on language, when we're trying to work on cognition, but also when does it make sense to write a goal more about the process to getting to the end goal versus the end goal itself? And do we need to use a blend of both? And ultimately, my answer is usually going to be that we do want to find a healthy blend of both types of goals as well as strategies. So I do provide examples of goals and observable behaviors that focus on the process in this session. So some highlights of this session include using the explicit instruction framework. So that's I do, we do, you do, or modeling, guided practice, and independent practice, using pauses, reflective questions, sentence starters, direct repetition, and declarative statements. And just a little hint, when we're scaffolding and supporting students, we typically should be using a blend of all of these things. So ultimately, we want to be creating a healthy blend and helping our students move along a continuum. Sometimes it is totally appropriate to do things that are really intensive supports, but other times it makes sense to fade that back. We need to understand how to, as I said, work along this continuum and have a number of different tools in our toolbox so that we can tell what's appropriate for the student or maybe the specific skill that the student is working on. Because sometimes they might be in one place for one skill and a completely different place in another skill. So I also talk about where we should use explicit, repetitive, decontextualized tasks in therapy for purposes of cognitive priming, and why students need a blend of structured and unstructured tasks. As I said before, this session comes out of a Q&A session I did in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about that program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. In the program, I give SLPs and other professionals working on language a framework that helps to build vocabulary using elements such as phonology, orthography, morphology, semantics, and syntax, and also emphasizing metacognition. To learn more, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. And also some of the goals that I mentioned, because I do talk a little bit about both language and executive functioning in this session. I also mentioned my School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning intervention in place. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Again, this session is an unedited session from a Q&A that I did with my members. So that's why with some of these FAQ sessions that I've posted on the podcast, it's why the audio sounds a little bit different. I may sound like I'm a little bit further away from the microphone because they are taken from a Facebook Live. So bear with me with some of the differences with audio. I do try to keep the quality as good as possible, but when I'm going between different platforms, I want to make sure that I am able to get this content out to you as quickly as possible. So that's why you might hear me clicking away, or if something pops up, if somebody asks me a question or I get a notification, sometimes you might hear me commenting about that in some of these sessions. As I said, bear with me. I want to minimize the editing that I have to do as much as possible so that I can get this content out to as many people as quickly as possible. Thank you again for listening, and please enjoy this Q&A session on task-based goals, strategy-based goals, and scaffolding for syntax and semantics. So thanks everybody for all your great questions. Today I am going to talk about two things. So I will be discussing scaffolding as well as how to make semantic feature analysis more contextualized. And then also I will be talking about task-based goals versus strategy goals, because I've had some questions about both of those things. And I think that both of these things would be useful for really all of our members to hear. So I will start off with a discussion of the semantic feature analysis scaffolding. Now, I have done past Q&As on this before because I do get a lot of questions about this, and it's something that I think is a pretty common thing. Whenever you're learning a new strategy in therapy, you might understand it conceptually, but then you have to go and try it out with your students in order to figure out, okay, where are they going to get stuck? How do I support them as they get stuck? How do I present this? And one of the ways that I like to support people is giving the framework, allowing them to go practice, and then coming back and letting me know what their specific questions are. I have had people say, people would love it if you would just tell them step by step exactly what to do for their entire therapy session, which I can give you a step-by-step guide in how to do a strategy, but what I can't necessarily do is tell you exactly how your students are going to respond. Now, I do know some common things that come up just having done this for a long time, but I can't exactly predict what's going to happen in your therapy session, so there does need to be some wiggle room. But what I can do is give you some ideas about how to scaffold, and then I wanted to have a conversation about making things more contextualized, because it is a common question that I get when I present some of these strategies. And I wanted to just to speak to that, because I do get that feedback sometimes. And really what it is that you want to make sure that you are presenting these things in a way that is conversational. So what you want to make sure that you're doing is taking a framework and thinking about how you would go all the way from something that is super structured to something that is very very unstructured. So a lot of times what we tend to do is go from the extremes. And so, for example, we have something that's really, really extreme on one side, where it's just kind of drilling and very, very rote repetition. And there actually is some value with those types of activities, but we don't want to stay there for our entire session. This is actually something that I talk about a lot. And then we have things that are really unstructured. So just using language when you're out living your life. It could even be, if it was something more classroom based, it could be something like using language when you are doing a reading comprehension activity, or while you're participating in a class discussion, if we wanted to give some school examples. Now, those types of activities, reading comprehension, for example, you might have to do that when you're out, in your life doing things. For example, you are out in public and you're asked to fill out a form. Like maybe you're at the doctor's office and you've got to read something and fill it out. So there are a lot of examples of contextualized ways to use language. But what we want to do is kind of bridge that gap. So what I'm going to do really quick here, I saw something pop up on my screen that I need to address really quick here before I continue. But yeah, so I want to make sure that we discuss that, just so that we know what exactly we're trying to accomplish here. So let me start off by talking about the scaffolding aspect. And I'll use semantic feature analysis as an example. I'll also use sentence combining as an example, because those are two places where people tend to want to get some support with just understanding, how do I scaffold? So one of the things that we want to remember is that when we are using any of these frameworks, we want to think about the explicit instruction framework that was outlined by Archer and Hughes. So again, I do, we do, you do. So I do, which is just you're modeling and you are doing the activity and your students are watching you. We do, you're doing it together. So they're trying a little bit, but you might be giving them a lot of support. And then you do, they're doing it on their own. And maybe you're nudging a little bit, but you're mostly letting them do that independently. Now, these phases aren't super rigid. There is some fluidity, because it's not like you say, all right, I've modeled, I'm never going to model again. It's going to be, we're moving on to we do. We're moving on to guided practice. We're not going to do that. It's not something that is rigid. We're going to be kind of moving back and forth between all of these phases. So the official terms for these for I do, we do, you do. So I do is modeling, we do is guided practice, you do is independent practice. So let me give you an example of how this could look with semantic feature analysis. So what you could do is that you could just say, hey, I'm going to show you a way that we can describe words. I'm going to use some strategies that are going to help you learn how to ask yourself questions, and it's going to help you give a lot of information about words. It's going to help you remember a lot of information. And this is going to be really helpful if you're having a conversation and you're trying to think of different ideas. It might help you when you are when you're writing, or when you're trying to think about what a word means in a test, or maybe when you're reading. And it's going to help you think about words differently. So you might start off with some kind of an explanation of why you're doing the activity. And then your modeling could just look like you describing a word for your students. And you might be even modeling how you would use some kind of a mnemonic device to remember how to ask yourself questions. You might even say, as I'm describing this word, I'm going to be asking myself questions in my head. And I might actually do them out loud for you, so you can see what kinds of questions I'm asking myself. And I'm going to use those questions to come up with a lot of different ideas. And if I get stuck and can't come up with an idea, I might just ask myself another question. So this could be, if you're describing a word, let's say you're describing a noun, let's say you're describing dog, you might say something like, this is a dog, it's an animal, it barks, and I might walk it. It can look furry. It can be all different kinds of colors, like brown and black and white. And so you might model how you would describe a word. And then you might say, while I was describing that word, I was asking myself questions in my head. And then you could go back and describe it again and say, okay, this is what was going on in my head when I was describing a dog for you. And then you could go through again. You might say, what group is it? Oh, well, it's a kind of animal. What does it do? Well, it walks. And so you would just go through like that in your modeling phase and show your students just how it looks when you're just describing a word without doing the questions out loud. And then you might go back again and say, this is what I was doing in my head as I was explaining that word. And so you could go through that a couple times. Again, what I generally recommend is do this process with words that are very concrete and words that you know that your students know, because there's a couple things going on here when your students can't think of ideas. It could be that they just legitimately don't know the answer, or it could be that they know the answer and they don't know how to show you what they know. So you want to make sure that when you're teaching a strategy, you're teaching the strategy with a word that the students already know, because then you can tell, well, they know the information, they're just having a hard time retrieving it. If you start with a more difficult word, sometimes it's difficult to tell if your students just, is it a retrieval problem, or do they just not, is it a knowledge issue? So that's how I recommend just generally progressing through that. And after you've modeled it a couple times, maybe you are going to give your students a chance to describe something. So one thing that is a good scaffolding strategy that people don't think of, that actually makes things, can kind of help facilitate the process, is that if you are describing a word, you think to yourself, well, I just described this for the students, I told them the answer. But actually, that process of them listening and then having to remember what you said and then having to retrieve those answers that you just said is actually a difficult skill. So what you could do as a part of scaffolding and making this gradually harder is that you could practice this strategy of describing words with the same word. So they saw you describe the word, and then they describe it immediately after you. So that's actually a scaffolding technique, because if you model for them one word, like let's say you model how to describe dog, and then you want them to describe cat, well, that's actually more difficult than just having them describe dog. So the process of them listening and having to repeat you is actually going to help build some of those connections with the strategy. So it's going to be a little more difficult for them if you model one word and then have them describe another. A way that you could ease them into it, if you notice that they're struggling, is you do it and then you have them do it with the same thing you just did, the same thing that you just asked them to do. The more novel you make it and the more different it is, the harder. So working up a hierarchy is a form of scaffolding. So when we think about how do we make things more or less difficult and work up a hierarchy, there are a couple different ways we can do it. One, we could make the task gradually go from easier to harder, or we could give them a more difficult task and then just provide more prompting and support and assistance, and then fade that assistance. So those are really those core ways that we want to think about scaffolding. Is, are we making the task gradually harder and gradually giving them more, or are we giving them the whole task and asking them to complete the whole thing and just fading the support that we're giving them? So those are two bigger principles that we want to think about when we're doing scaffolding. Some other ideas regarding how you might support during semantic study is that, let's say that you've modeled and you're at the point where you want to have students just like you're at the point where you want them to do we do. So you want them to start doing this on their own, and you're gonna, maybe you've modeled and you want to get them to the point that they're in guided practice where they're doing it, giving them a little bit of support. So what we want to do there is, there's a couple things. So one, I would just give them the opportunity to see what they can give you. Don't jump in and give them that support right away. Make sure that you're using pauses. And this is just one thing that you can do in a lot of places, just kind of across the board, is make sure that you're giving that wait time and those pauses, because a lot of times your students might be thinking, and if you jump in and prompt too soon, maybe they were actually going to come up with the answer if you would have given them some more time. So let's say that they're describing a word and they're getting stuck on category. So what you could do there, again, is you give them the pause, and then there are a couple things that you can do in order to help them move on to the next stage. To describe category and then move on to something like describing the function. So what you might say is, again, they're describing the word and they're not able to come up with the answer. Some options you have there after you've paused and you're pretty sure that they're not going to come up with it on their own are, you might start the sentence for them. So you might say, it's a kind of, and then they can fill in the blank there. Or, and that's a little bit more of a direct, what you could also do is say something like, where can you go to look for this information? Or you might say, what question might you ask yourself? Or you might just say, what group does it belong? Or like start the question for them, but kind of direct their attention to wherever the information is that is going to help them retrieve that question. You might say, what? And start the question, but not ask the full question. You want to get away from just asking them the questions on their own, or asking them the questions and having them be reliant on you to ask the questions. What we want to do is kind of guide them to what questions can you ask yourself, and have some kind of a tool in the room where you can say, hey, look over here. And maybe this is some kind of a visual device. Maybe you're using some kind of visuals that are symbols that go with the different questions. One example of this is the expanding expression tool, where there's green group. Well, that reminds you to ask yourself the question, what group does it go in? So maybe you have some of those things. So yes, there might be times when you might just have to ask them the question, but that's kind of a last resort. You always want to see if you can get themselves to be able to look around the room and think about it and ask themselves the question. You may even make a comment that's going to direct them to where they might need to look. Like, oh, I see you have your visual strategy right in front of you, or I see you have your strand of beads in front of you. And that's just another example if you're using the EET. So make a comment that helps them direct their attention to where the information might be. So let me go through those strategies again. So this is, you're describing a word with your students. They're not coming up with the answer. What options do you have for supporting them? So those things that I just said would be always pausing to make sure that they are giving you, like you're giving them the chance to actually figure it out. You may start the sentence for them. You may start the question for them. You may ask a more indirect, reflective question about where they might be able to go for information, like what question could you ask yourself? Where could you go to figure this out? Where could you look to figure it out? You might say, make a comment that's just more of a just general comment, not even a direct question, like, oh, I see that your tool is right on the table, just to direct them towards where they can look. So those are some strategies we have now. One thing that is more of a direct way, and this is a more intensive scaffold, would be that you say, it's a kind of animal. And then you back up and say, all right, your turn, and have them repeat it. So remember that repetition and having students practice saying those answers is actually a form of scaffolding and a form of allowing them to practice. But again, we always want to give that wait time and use a less intensive prompt when at all possible, because that's going to help them to actually think through this on their own. You want to allow them to do as much of the thinking on their own as possible, because you don't want them to get into this habit of knowing that you're going to just ask them the questions, and because ultimately what you want to do is get them in the habit of asking themselves the question. That's the whole purpose of semantic feature analysis. One other thing that I wanted to mention on the topic of contextualized versus decontextualized is that doing something that is kind of a drill-based activity has a place in therapy, as long as that's not all we're doing. It can't be the only tool in your toolbox, but it is a form of scaffolding. And it's a form of scaffolding because it can be cognitive priming. So for example, let's say that you have a student who is really struggling with categories, and you know that they're always going to get stuck on that part, but if you can get them past it, they're going to be able to come up with more on their own for the other types of attributes that you might be describing. What you can do is just at the very beginning of your session, or right before you are describing the word, is you can just do kind of a drill, like let me just give you some some words and let's practice naming the category just for a couple minutes, just to prime them and remind them and give them some practice of thinking categorically. That can be, even though it's very decontextualized, when you pair that with something that is more descriptive and requires a little more back and forth interaction, it can actually kind of prime their brain to get ready to remember that piece of information that they tend to struggle with or tend to forget. So that's where that can be useful. Again, those drill-based activities, it's kind of like how when you are like if you've ever gone to like a professional like basketball game, you see the players dribbling and doing their drills beforehand, and then they're eventually going to go and play the game. They're not going to only do those drills, but those drills help them to remember the movement patterns and get that muscle memory. So cognitive priming works the same way. It's kind of like a warm up for your brain. So that's where you can start to pull in some of those more drill based activities. I will say, just a reminder, and I've said this before, anytime you have a word that is a defining feature, or sorry, anytime you have an attribute that is a defining feature, it's going to be more difficult, and it's typical for students, even neurotypical students, to not be able to give you the defining feature of a word until maybe second grade or so. So for example, if you're describing a noun, that means kids might be able to describe words, but it will be difficult for them to give you the category because that's the defining feature. And then for things like adjectives and verbs, it's going to be more difficult for them to say the synonym because that's the defining feature until they're, again, later elementary school. It's common for students to not be able to do that. So our students, keeping in mind that they might be, again, they've got some language skills that they're working on, it might be a couple of years later for them that they're able to do that. It doesn't mean that we don't work on it, though. What you do is you give them the opportunity to practice that skill with scaffolding, knowing that they might need that scaffolding because that's what's going to support that skill. So again, it's going to be normal for you to need to provide some support for those defining features when you are working on describing words, when you're doing things like semantic feature analysis and definition syntax. It is going to be harder, and that's why we're working on it. One thing that I often get asked is when you're working on describing words with semantic study, what do you do for those students who just can't remember or can't give you that much? Maybe they can't get through the whole strategy of describing all the different attributes. That's fine. What we're doing is we're expanding on what students have, so you don't have to feel like, you don't have to panic or anything if students can't tell you every single attribute, or you don't have to wait until they can give you all the attributes before you move on to definition syntax or some of the other strategies. What we're doing is just expanding. Again, remember, with a lot of the strategies that I teach you in the program, we're going to work on one for a couple weeks and then cycle to another one and keep cycling through. And a lot of times that process of cycling through different skills is what helps students to kind of make those connections. So this isn't about perfection and feeling like they have to give you an answer for everything, every single attribute, because sometimes there are certain words where it doesn't even make sense to do that. That's part of being flexible with language. But then the other thing is that what we want to do is just increase what students currently are able to do. So if they're improving, like let's say that maybe they can only give you just a couple functions of words, and now they can maybe give you 3 or 4 different attributes, that is a great improvement. So that is, something that we want to be able to see. The other thing is that sometimes people ask me, well, should I only teach the category and only teach the function, and like, should I just do a couple at a time? I would always give your students the opportunity to give you as much as they can. So I would encourage them, and when you're modeling it, to do the whole thing. So describe all the attributes. Now, if they don't give you everything, that's okay. If they require scaffolding to give additional attributes, that's fine. So let's say that you're on category and they've given you the category and they're like, it's, it's a dog, it's an animal, it barks. And by the time you get to describing associations, they've kind of like puttered out or they're not able to do it. You can use some of those scaffolding techniques to encourage them to keep going and stick with it. But you don't have to feel like, there's not a rigid hierarchy for how you teach all of those different semantic features. Now, if you're familiar with the language processing hierarchy that was published by the authors that published the language processing test, it is definitely true that some attributes are more difficult than others. So that's going to give you an idea of which attributes might be easier for students and what areas they might need additional scaffolding. So for example, they might need more scaffolding in category than they need for associations, for example. And so when you're doing those priming activities, that gives you an idea of, if I'm going to do a quick priming activity and focus on just one of these types of attributes, it's going to give you an idea of where you might need to do those priming activities a little bit more, but you don't have to teach them in a rigid form where we've got to do associations first before we can do function and category, for example. It's just information about how difficult those skills are. So that kind of brings me to the conversation about making things more contextualized. So I wanted to pause there and just kind of recap what I've talked about so far, because these are questions that I get a lot, and I know that I've covered a lot so far. So just an overview, some common things that you can be thinking about as you're doing semantic feature study and definition syntax is that you're using the explicit instruction framework. You are using different types of scaffolding, including pausing and including encouraging students to be able to ask themselves the questions. We are also thinking about those more drill-based activities are little quick things that we can insert at the beginning of a therapy session, or maybe you can even pause for a couple minutes in the middle of a therapy session, in the middle of a more contextualized activity, and do cognitive priming. And again, that's a place where those types of activities can be useful. And then finally, yes, we know that there is a hierarchy for how difficult different semantic attributes are. But that being said, when we describe words, we don't necessarily have to isolate them into separate sessions. We can work on them all at once, knowing that the ones that are more difficult are going to be the ones where students need more scaffolding. So that's how I think about incorporating all of that. So to the question about how do I make semantic feature analysis contextualized? So the way that we should be doing this, it already should be contextualized to some extent. Now, is it as contextualized as you're out in public and you're having to, like, let's say that you are, I'll use an example of something that I did this week. I had to sign up to get my flu shot. So I had to go on my phone and understand a bunch of different technical words. I had to understand technical medical vocabulary, and then I had to go to the pharmacy and talk to someone and remember what I had done before when I signed up for the appointment. So that is very contextualized. I have to pull in a lot of vocabulary skills. I need to retrieve and ask myself questions. If I'm not quite sure what a word is, I have to use that categorical information. So for example, like the categories that I might need to know are the different things that I'm, like the different diseases that I'm being vaccinated for. So like when I see the list of things, I have to think, okay, COVID is one of those conditions. Influenza is, hepatitis B. So I'm categorizing things in my head. I'm using that information about category in a very functional activity. Now go to the other extreme. Something really decontextualized is that I might be sitting and doing a cognitive priming exercise with my students on category, and there's two different ways we can do it. We can say, tell me as many diseases as you can think of. So they're thinking categorically, all right,
I'm thinking about this one specific category and I'm going to name as many things as I possibly can. Or I could do it the other way around and I could say, here are some words, tell me the category. So I might say hepatitis, and you might say it's a kind of disease. So, and then I might say something else like, let me try to think of something that has to do with this activity, like vaccination. You might say it's a kind of medical treatment. So these are more difficult examples that I'm giving you. Something easier would be like, tell me as many animals as you can think of, and you could say dog, cat, bear, or I might say do it the other way around and give you the word dog, and you have to say it's an animal, grapes, it's a fruit, and so on. So there's a couple different ways we can do that more structured activity. So again, we have really decontextualized, structured, and then we have really contextualized. I'm out in public and I'm having to use all these different vocabulary words that I know and retrieve them and ask myself questions. So we've got two sides of the extremes there. Semantic feature analysis and definition syntax fall in the middle, and it's really important to have the whole continuum. Sometimes it's totally appropriate to do a priming exercise in therapy to move your students through something that is more contextualized. But if we just start, or if we always try to stay really contextualized and unstructured, it doesn't necessarily give our students the intensity and the practice with those skills that they need in order to get to that application. So, semantic feature analysis, making it contextualized, it already is by definition, by the way that the activity works, because we're not just sitting there only working on associations, only working on categories. We are using a descriptive activity, or an activity where students are describing words, to take some of those more structured activities and apply. So it's more difficult for your students to just, if you said, tell me everything you know about a cat, that is more contextualized than just the rote naming exercise. And you can make this interaction, again, you can make it very interactive. It doesn't have to be that they're sitting and drilling. You could do this in a written form where they're writing things down. That is an option for doing this activity, for describing words. You could have them write everything you know about a cat. Or you could have it be more conversational. You could even say things like, to one student A and student B, tell student A, pretend like student B over here doesn't know what a cat is. Like maybe he's from another planet and he doesn't know about it. I want you just to have a conversation with him. Tell him everything you know about a cat. And it can be a very interactive experience and very conversational. And then even when your students get stuck and you have that opportunity to say, I wonder where we could go to find that information. Maybe you haven't had a discussion with students about this word that you're describing, and maybe you have to like do an internet search or read a book or something to go and actually find out what is this word's category. So that might be part of your activity. So again, it's starting to get way more functional because it's not something where you're just drill, drill, drill. It's an opportunity to describe words, think about how your brain works and how you might cue yourself, and maybe even look up some information and figure out how we might describe a word. You're going to find that as you do different words and it as you describe words with your students and it gets more difficult, there are going to be times when you might not know the answer. So you might say, you know what, I'm stuck too. Like, let me show you how I might look up this information. Now, generally, if you have a situation like that where you have to kind of pause the activity and go and look something up and write it down, what I recommend doing is kind of doing the exploratory activity, but then coming back later once you have all the information and saying, okay, now that we've done all the research and we figured out all the answers, let's go back through and say, all right, how might we describe this word? And then you kind of go back through it again. So that's a way that you could make this, again, a very conversational, exploratory, discussion-based activity. It's not meant to be something that is very drill-based. So, like I said, we've got to really be flexible with how we think about contextualized versus decontextualized. A lot of times people think contextualized means it's not in my therapy session, like it's decontextualized if I'm doing anything structured. That's not true at all. If you're requiring students to use a lot of these skills, it is um, it is requiring a lot of them. It's requiring a lot of mental energy from them. Um, One thing that I did want to mention before, because we're already at 8, we're already 40 minutes in, and I haven't gotten to the discussion on goals. I can link to below this video some videos where I've talked about definite or the syntax, how you would scaffold for syntax, but you can use the same explicit instruction framework for syntax as well. And remembering that you're going to start with your explanation about we're going to do this activity. It's going to help you to, understand how sentences are put together. It's going to help you to understand details and messages, which is going to be really important for when you're reading or when you're out in public. You explain the why, and then you're going to model the activity, whether it be you're combining sentences and putting them together or whether you're deconstructing them and putting them apart. And also remember that repetition is a strategy. If students have to listen to what you say and then repeat it back, that actually might be very difficult for them, and it is going to give them the opportunity to practice skills. I think that sometimes we forget that repetition actually gives us a good idea of how well students are able to use different syntactic structures, because it will be difficult for them to repeat if they don't have a structure in their repertoire already. So we don't want to sit there and do sentence repetition for the whole session, but it can be a very powerful activity to work in as part of your toolbox. It definitely can be a good priming exercise as well. So again, doing those more structured activities can actually be really challenging for our students, and we want to make sure that they flex those cognitive muscles in our therapy sessions to make sure that we're building that foundation so that they can actually apply to those other situations. Because thinking about what I just said regarding, having to sign up for a vaccine, there's probably a lot of complex syntax in the form that I had to fill out. So that's just, something to think about as well, is that we do need to give students that practice. Okay. Before I wrap up, I wanted to give some examples of task-based goals versus strategy-based goals and what this even means. So just to kind of back up and talk more philosophically about goals. So when I went through my communication sciences and disorders program, it was definitely very focused on observable behaviors with goals. So things that you can physically observe someone doing. And then when I got into my special ed doctoral program, that's when the emphasis was really on SMART goals. So specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, timely. So I think you can use that SMART format when you're using strategy-based or task-based goals. But I have changed the way that I explain this when I am thinking about executive functioning, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and completely dismiss any explanations that I would have given before that are focused more on the external behaviors. We still do need to track external behaviors, but we don't want to only track external behaviors. So let me give you a couple examples. I will start with semantics and syntax, and then I'll give you some other examples of more macro level language goals, and then some strategy goals that are really more focused on internal behaviors and internal processes and executive functioning. Now, I would caution you against only doing goals on those internal processes, because we do need to draw the connection between those two things, but we need to have a nice blend of both of them, because I've seen people go too far in one direction or the other. So when we're thinking about things that are observable, I have really kind of gotten on my soapbox in the past and said, if you can't see someone doing it, you can't measure it. So for example, if somebody says student will comprehend, well, how do you know they're comprehending? What physical, observable thing do you want to see them doing to show their comprehension? So, for example, if you are working on syntax and you want to know if a student can comprehend difficult sentence types, your goal might be student will answer questions about details in sentences with complex syntax. So, for example, how that would look and how you would measure it is that you might have a sentence that has that is a complex sentence, has subordinate conjunction in it with multiple, at least two or more clauses, and you might say the sentence and then ask your student a question about it. So that is an example of a very observable goal that can help you assess comprehension of syntax. Another example would be you could have a goal for sentence repetition. That might be okay depending on where your students are. You might also have a goal for the student will say or the student will write sentences with, complex, or let me rephrase that. Student will say or write complex sentences. And maybe you split it up with saying and writing. But the way that you can physically observe whether or not students have those syntactic skills is, can they answer a question about a sentence that has those complex sentence structures? And can they say the sentence? Can they produce it? Can they repeat a sentence that you said with those structures in it? And can they write sentences with those structures in it? So those are your 4 observable things: is answering questions, repeating, saying, writing. So those are examples for syntax. Now, do you also want to have some goals that are more macro level to show whether or not your students can kind of put it all together and get the gist? Maybe you have some goals about stating the main idea and stating details, answering inferencing questions. Yes, if your students are struggling with complex syntax, it's going to be hard for them to do all of those things, for them to inference, for them to state the main idea. But it doesn't necessarily pinpoint, because there could be other reasons why your students are struggling to get the main idea. Could be more of an executive functioning, just attention to detail kind of a thing. It could also be that maybe there's some additional vocabulary issues. So syntax can impact those higher level goals. So it is important to have those goals. But if you want to really hone in on syntax, it is beneficial for your students to have those specific goals that do pinpoint syntax. Now, if you're just starting this framework and you have a bunch of students with stating the main idea and WH question goals and they're broader, you can certainly start working on syntax right now. It's going to impact those goals. You're still targeting those goals. But then when you update their IEP, you probably want to think about making those goals more specific. You don't have to rework every single IEP you have on your caseload necessarily, but this is just something to think of when you start using this framework and when you start updating some of those treatment plans or IEPs. So let me give you an example of some observable goals for semantics. So typically what we're doing in here is that we are teaching students to use self-questioning to retrieve more information and be more aware of different information. So for example, if we're teaching students to describe words based on category, and they're going to be more aware that category is a thing. So when they encounter words, they're going to be paying more attention to that information. That's what we want them to be doing internally. But what we want to see externally, so that we have some indication about how to track this in therapy, is that we would want to have them do, the goal could be something like student will describe and define a word using 3 to 4 attributes. And then the way that you could make that goal more specific is that if you do know that they need more emphasis on category, for example, or one of the other features, you might specifically say, including the category. You might have a little, something in parentheses in your goal that specifies that that is one of the attributes that you want to see. Student will define and describe words using multiple attributes, including the category. So that's an example of how you could make that goal more specific. But again, the basic observable behavior that we want to see is define, describe words using however number of attributes. I recommend starting with, if you've got a student who's really struggling, you might start with 2, but generally speaking, I recommend that you start by having the goal be 3 to 4 attributes. How you would make this more specific for definition syntax is you might say students will give definitions of words with the defining feature present. So students will give descriptions of nouns, verbs, and adjectives, including the defining features. So this could mean that if you are doing this for a verb, it means that they have to have the synonym in order for it to be considered correct. For a noun, it would be that the category has to be present. And then for adjectives as well, it would be the synonyms. So, and again, there's ways that you could break that goal down and like maybe have one goal for nouns, one goal for verbs, just because those skills are a little bit different. So those are some examples of observable things. Again, these are task-based activities, things that you can physically see. Where it gets a little trickier is that when you have students who, like, let's say you've been working on syntax for a while and they need a goal for writing, for example, because syntax can really impact writing. Something that is more of a task-based external behavior is the output or the end goal that you would want to see for them to show that they have those writing skills. These writing skills would obviously require a lot of internal planning, but the goal that would be the output or the task-based goal would be something like, student will write an essay with 5 paragraphs, including an introduction and a conclusion. And obviously you can collaborate with your teachers and the different staff in your building to figure out what would be appropriate for these types of goals. So I used to say the goal is the goal, the end goal is the most important thing, that you want to make sure that you have that specific goal that says what is the actual output. Because I used to see goals like student will use a graphic organizer, or student will complete their assignment notebook. Student will, complete their checklist. And I would say that tool is the tool that you want to use to get them to the end goal.